There's a particular kind of darkness that certain people willingly walk into, the psychological darkness of complete helplessness, the kind where your hands shake on the controller and your breath catches in your throat because you know you can't fight back. You can only run. You can only hide. You can only witness. This is the reality for the people who don't just play Outlast. They crave it. They return to Mount Massive Asylum again and again. They defend the battery mechanic that most people hate, and they see something in Miles Upsher's camera lens that reveals more about themselves than they're comfortable admitting. But here's what nobody talks about. The person loading up Outlast for the 5th time. Who knows exactly when Chris Walker will crash through that wall? Who's memorized every hiding spot in the sewers? Who can navigate the darkest corridors without even using the night vision? That person isn't doing it for fun. At least not fun in any way most people would recognize. They're doing it because somewhere along the line, Outlast became a language for something they couldn't articulate any other way. And understanding why requires going deeper than jump scares and gore. It requires examining what kind of person needs to feel powerless in order to feel seen. When Red Barrels made the decision to strip Miles of any ability to defend himself, they weren't just creating a gameplay mechanic. They were making a statement about a specific type of human experience. The experience of being completely vulnerable in the face of overwhelming horror. No guns, no knives, not even a stick to swing at the things hunting you through the asylum's corridors. Just a camera, a notebook, and the desperate hope that you can hide until the danger passes. Most players found this frustrating. They complained that it made the game feel unfair, that it removed player agency, that it turned horror into a tedious game of hide and seek. But for a specific subset of players, this wasn't a flaw. It was the entire point. These are people who understand powerlessness intimately. They've lived through experiences where fighting back wasn't an option, where all the agency in the world wouldn't have changed the outcome, where survival meant becoming very good at being invisible. When they play Outlast, they're not frustrated by the lack of weapons, they're validated. Finally, a game that understands what it actually feels like when you can't fight the thing that's hunting you. Finally, a game that doesn't lie to you about agency and control. Finally, a game that says, sometimes you're just prey, and your only job is to not get caught. The psychology of loving Outlast begins with recognizing what the game actually offers. It's not empowerment fantasy. It's not problem-solving satisfaction. It's not even cathartic violence against representations of your fears. It's witness. It's documentation. Miles is a journalist, and his entire function in Mount Massive Asylum is to record what's happening, to gather evidence, to bear witness to atrocity. He can't stop any of it. He can't save anyone. He can barely save himself, but he can document it. He can make sure someone knows what happened here. For people who've experienced trauma that nobody believed, trauma that left no visible scars, trauma that happened in spaces where no witnesses existed, this documenting function resonates on a profound level. The camera becomes a metaphor for their own desperate need to prove that what happened to them was real. The battery mechanic that most players despise becomes a perfect representation of how exhausting it is to constantly gather evidence for suffering that should be self-evident. You have to keep finding new batteries, you have to keep the light on, because if you stop documenting, if the camera dies, then it's like it never happened at all. Mount Massive Asylum itself operates as more than just a setting. It's a physical manifestation of institutional betrayal, the specific horror of being trapped in a place that was supposed to help you but instead became the source of your torment. The Murkoff Corporation presented the asylum as a psychiatric facility, a place of healing and treatment. In reality, it was a site of experimentation, torture, and dehumanization. patients became variants. The treatment became torture. The caregivers became captors. This inversion of trust, this perversion of institutional care into institutional harm, speaks directly to anyone who's been failed by systems that promise protection. Think about who gravitates toward Outlast when they walk through Mount Massive's corridors and see the scattered files documenting Murkoff's experiments, when they read Father Martin's gospel about witnessing horror, when they encounter the variants who are simultaneously victims and threats. They're not just playing a horror game. They're processing their own experiences with institutions that betrayed them. The variants themselves reveal fascinating psychology about how Outlast functions for its devoted fans. These aren't zombies or demons or generic monsters. They're people who've been so profoundly damaged by what was done to them that they've fractured into something that barely resembles humanity anymore. Chris Walker, the massive war veteran turned asylum patient turned hunter, represents trauma's ability to turn survivors into threats. He was a soldier with PTSD who became a test subject for the morphogenic engine, and the experiments broke something fundamental in him. He's not evil, he's shattered, and his attempts to help by killing everyone in the asylum come from a distorted understanding of protection. Eddie Gluskin, the groom, reveals even darker psychology. His workshop of mutilated corpses represents his attempts to recreate normalcy through utterly abnormal means. He wants a bride. He wants a traditional marriage. But his understanding of these things has been so warped by his own abuse that he can only enact them through violence. For players who understand how trauma distorts your ability to conceptualize normal relationships, how it makes you reenact your damage even when you're desperately trying to build something healthy, Eddie isn't just a disturbing enemy. He's a warning about what happens when you don't process what was done to you. Richard Traeger and his obsession with fingers, his insistence on treating Miles, his surgical theater where he performs mutilations while maintaining the veneer of medical professionalism. This character operates as the embodiment of medical trauma. He was a Murkoff executive who became a patient, and his variant persona fused his corporate cruelty with medical sadism when he straps Miles down and prepares to remove his fingers, when he speaks in soothing tones about helping and healing while causing unimaginable pain. Anyone who's been held down for procedures they didn't consent to, anyone who's heard, "This is for your own good," while being harmed, recognizes this dynamic immediately. Father Martin presents perhaps the most psychologically complex character in Outlast's narrative. He believes Miles is his apostle, chosen to bear witness to the birth of the Wall Rider. He guides Miles through the asylum not to help him escape, but to ensure he sees everything, documents everything, understands the full scope of what Murkoff has created. His gospel speaks of revelation through suffering, of truth that can only be accessed through witnessing horror. For fans of Outlast, Father Martin represents a disturbing truth, that sometimes the people who push you deeper into trauma believe they're serving a higher purpose, that they frame your suffering as necessary for some greater revelation. But here's where it gets interesting. Many Outlast fans actually identify with Father Martin more than they identify with Miles. They see themselves as the ones who want others to understand, who want to force witnesses to see what they've seen, who believe that true understanding only comes through experiencing the horror firsthand. This isn't sadism exactly. It's a desperate need for validation so intense that it wants to recreate the conditions of trauma in others so they'll finally get it. When these fans evangelize about Outlast, when they carefully orchestrate first playthroughs for friends, when they refuse to explain the game beforehand because you have to experience it yourself, they're acting out Father Martin's psychology They're making apostles. They're creating witnesses. The morphogenic engine and the wall rider represent the game's core horror, operating on both literal and metaphorical levels. Literally, the engine is a machine that allows manipulation of lucid dream states in comatose patients. The wall rider is a swarm of nanomachines that achieved sentience and merged with Billy Hope, becoming something supernatural seeming in its abilities. But metaphorically, the morphogenic engine represents trauma's ability to invade your dreams, to make sleep unsafe, to colonize even your unconscious mind. And the wall rider represents the way trauma takes on a life of its own, how it becomes an entity separate from the original event, something that haunts you and controls you and eventually consumes your identity entirely. Billy Hope, the patient who became the wall rider's host, is referred to in files you find throughout the asylum. He was the one successful test subject out of dozens. The engine worked on him because he could maintain lucid consciousness even in a vegetative state. When you finally encounter him at the end of Outlast, you see an emaciated figure suspended in machinery, kept alive artificially, consciousness merged with the nanite swarm. The wall rider uses his body as an anchor, but exists independently. Billy is trapped between life and death, consciousness and coma, human and something else entirely. For people who love Outlast, Billy represents the ultimate horror of losing autonomy over your own consciousness. He's aware, he's conscious, but he has no control over what the wall rider does using his identity. This mirrors the experience of dissociation, of watching yourself do things while feeling disconnected from your actions, of having your body and mind hijacked by trauma responses you can't control. The reveal that Miles becomes the new host for the wall rider at the end of the game, that he escapes the asylum only to become the thing he was documenting, hits differently for people who understand how investigating your trauma sometimes means becoming consumed by it. Waylon Park, the whistleblower from the Whistleblower DLC, provides important counterpoint to Miles's story. Waylon is a software engineer who worked at Mount Massive, maintaining the morphogenic engine. He's the one who sent the anonymous email that brought Miles to the asylum. After being caught and subjected to the engine himself, he spends the DLC trying to escape so he can get back to his wife and children. Unlike Miles, who has no one waiting for him, Waylon has powerful motivation to survive beyond just documentation. And crucially, he actually makes it out. He escapes. He survives. The psychology of which protagonist Outlast fans identify with reveals something about their own position regarding trauma. Miles represents the person who investigates horror professionally, who thinks they can remain detached and observational, only to discover that bearing witness implicates you in ways you can't escape. Waylon represents the person who was complicit in systems of harm, who tried to do the right thing by exposing them, who got punished for that attempt, and who fights desperately to return to normal life. Miles has nothing to return to. Waylon has everything to return to. One is consumed by what he documents. The other escapes to testify. People who identify more with Miles tend to be those who feel their trauma has become their identity, that they are the documentation of what happened to them, that they can't separate their sense of self from their role as witness. People who identify with Waylon tend to feel they had a life before trauma, a life they're fighting to get back to, a normal existence that trauma interrupted but didn't entirely erase. Neither identification is healthier than the other. They're just different relationships with how trauma has structured identity. The night vision mechanic deserves specific psychological analysis because it's the most distinctive gameplay element and the one that generates the most debate. Using the camera's night vision allows you to see in complete darkness, but it rapidly drains battery life. Most of Outlast takes place in darkness. You're constantly making decisions about when to use night vision, when to conserve battery, when to risk moving through darkness blind, versus when to use precious battery life to navigate. This creates a gameplay rhythm of scarcity and risk assessment that most players find frustrating. But for people who love Outlast, this mechanic perfectly captures the economics of trauma survival. You have limited resources. You have to constantly assess risk. Sometimes you have to move forward blind because you can't afford to use your resources even though you're terrified of what you can't see. And the batteries, scattered throughout the asylum, never quite plentiful enough, always running out at the worst moments, represent the external support and internal reserves that trauma survivors constantly need but never have quite enough of. You're always searching for the next battery. You're always worried about running out. The game makes resource scarcity into a constant low-grade anxiety that mirrors what it feels like to survive on insufficient emotional and material resources. The hiding mechanics reveal similar psychology. You can hide in lockers, under beds, behind obstacles. When an enemy is hunting you, hiding is often your only option, but hiding isn't safe. Enemies can check hiding spots. You have to hold your breath to stay quiet, but you can't hold it forever. If you hide in the same spot repeatedly, some enemies learn and check there first. The game teaches you that hiding is necessary but never secure. There's no place in Mount Massive where you're truly safe. This mirrors how trauma survivors relate to safety. They develop elaborate strategies for hiding from danger: emotional hiding, psychological hiding, physical hiding. But none of these strategies provide genuine safety. The danger can always find you. You can hold your breath and make yourself small, but you can't do it forever. And if you rely on the same coping mechanisms too consistently, your trauma learns your patterns and finds you anyway. The game's hiding mechanics aren't just about stealth gameplay. They're about the exhausting inadequacy of safety strategies that are necessary but never sufficient. The asylum's different sections each represent distinct types of institutional horror. The admin block where you first enter represents bureaucratic cruelty: scattered files documenting experiments in detached clinical language, offices where administrators plan torture as if it were just paperwork. The prison block represents carceral horror, cells and restraints, and the violence of confinement. The underground lab represents medical horror, examination rooms, and surgical theaters, and the perversion of healing into harm. The sewers represent the literal depths you have to wade through, the filth and waste of the institution's hidden processes. Moving through these spaces in sequence creates a journey through layers of institutional betrayal. You start with paperwork and policy. You descend through implementation and enforcement. You discover the hidden mechanisms underneath, and throughout, you encounter the people destroyed by each layer. The administrators turned into variants in their own offices, the prisoners who became experimental subjects, the scientists who got consumed by their own creations, the geography of Mount Massive maps, the psychology of institutional trauma. The moment when Chris Walker throws you through a window and you fall several stories into the sewers represents a forced descent into the underbelly of the institution. You literally fall from the surface level into the hidden depths. You're injured, limping, barely conscious, and you have to navigate the most dangerous section of the asylum in this weakened state. This moment feels unfair to many players. You were already struggling, and now the game has made it even harder. But for people who connect deeply with Outlast, This forced descent into worse conditions while already traumatized perfectly captures how trauma compounds, how you rarely get to process one horror before the next one drops you into something worse. Eddie Gluskin's section in the Whistleblower DLC stands as perhaps the most disturbing sequence in the entire franchise. You're trapped in his workshop, surrounded by the corpses of his failed brides, and he's hunting you with the explicit intention of sexual mutilation. The game doesn't show this violence graphically, but the implication is clear and horrifying. This section generated significant controversy, with some critics arguing it crossed lines of taste and potentially triggered sexual assault survivors. But here's the complex part. Many people with sexual trauma history found this section powerful, precisely because it took that threat seriously. Eddie isn't a joke. He's not camp or over the top. He's genuinely terrifying in his delusion and his violence. The game treats the threat of sexual violence as the horror it actually is, not as titillation or shock value, but as something that fundamentally violates your sense of bodily autonomy and safety. For survivors who feel their experiences get trivialized or sexualized in media, Eddie's section hits differently. It's not fun to play through, it's not enjoyable, but it acknowledges the specific horror of sexual threat in ways most games avoid entirely. The cannibal in the cafeteria represents another type of horror, the reduction of humans to meat, the consumption of identity, the transformation of care spaces into sites of predation. You encounter him eating someone. He then hunts you through the kitchen and storage areas. The environmental storytelling of this section, the tables where patients once ate meals, the industrial kitchen where food was prepared, now repurposed as sites of cannibalistic violence, suggests how easily care infrastructure becomes harm infrastructure when oversight fails. These different enemy types aren't just variety in gameplay design, they represent different ways trauma manifests and different types of threats that traumatized people internalize. Chris Walker is overwhelming physical force. Eddie is sexual threat. Richard Traeger is medical violation. The cannibal is dehumanization. Father Martin is spiritual manipulation. Each represents a different flavor of powerlessness, a different situation where you can't fight back, you can only survive. And people who love Outlast have usually experienced multiple types of these threats. They recognize the full spectrum of vulnerability, the game maps, the files and documents you collect throughout the asylum serve crucial psychological functions. They provide context for the horror, explaining who these people were before they became variants, documenting Murkoff's experiments, revealing the scope of institutional cruelty. But they also provide something else, evidence. You're gathering proof, you're building a case. Even though Miles doesn't survive to publish his story, even though the documentation ultimately doesn't stop Murkoff, the act of gathering evidence provides a sense of purpose to the nightmare you're trapped in. For people who needed evidence of their own trauma, who needed proof that what happened really happened, who needed documentation because their memories felt unreliable or because no one believed them, this evidence-gathering function of Outlast resonates powerfully. The game says yes, document everything, gather all the proof, make sure there's a record. It doesn't promise that the documentation will lead to justice or even to escape, but it validates the desperate need to gather evidence, to create a record, to make sure someone knows what happened here. Father Martin's gospel, which you encounter in scattered pages throughout the asylum, deserves specific analysis. He writes about revelation, about God's plan, about the necessity of bearing witness to horror. His theology is twisted but internally consistent. He believes the Wall Rider is a divine entity, that its birth required suffering, that those who witness it are blessed. His writings blur the line between religious devotion and psychotic break, between faith and delusion. For people who love Outlast, Father Martin's gospel functions similarly to how religious trauma survivors relate to distorted theology. He takes the language of meaning and purpose and revelation and uses it to frame unspeakable cruelty as necessary. This mirrors how religious institutions often frame abuse as discipline, suffering as purification, trauma as God's plan. His writings are horrifying not because they're incomprehensible, but because they're almost comprehensible, because you can see the logic that would make someone believe them, and that proximity to belief makes them more disturbing than simple madness would be. The Whistleblower DLC's ending, where Wayland escapes and emails the footage to journalists, provides the closest thing to hope the franchise offers. He made it out. The evidence got published. There are consequences for Murkoff, at least temporarily. But even this hopeful ending is complicated by what we learn in Outlast 2 and the Murkoff account comics, that the corporation continues operating, that they move to new projects, that exposure didn't stop them. This bittersweet quality, you survived, you got the evidence out, and it ultimately didn't matter as much as you hoped, mirrors how many trauma survivors experience attempts at accountability and justice. The Walrider's nature as a nanite swarm rather than a supernatural entity represents an interesting choice by the developers. The game could have made it a demon or ghost, could have gone supernatural. Instead, it's technology run amok, scientific experiment achieving something that appears supernatural but has a rational explanation. This grounds the horror in human cruelty rather than otherworldly evil. The Walrider exists because people created it. Mount Massive's nightmares are human-made. This matters psychologically because it refuses to let players off the hook by externalizing evil onto something inhuman. The horror of Outlast is entirely anthropogenic. People did this, institutions did this. The monsters are victims of human systems. Even the Walrider, which seems like it transcends humanity, is still operating through human hosts with human consciousness. There's no evil deity to blame, no demonic possession that removes agency, just human cruelty implemented through institutional structures. This refusal of supernatural absolution hits hard for people whose trauma came from entirely human sources, family, institutions, systems of power. The relationship between Outlast fans and the concept of fun in gaming reveals significant tension with broader gaming culture. When someone asks, "Is Outlast fun?" devoted fans often struggle to answer. By conventional metrics, enjoyment, satisfaction, pleasure, Outlast frequently isn't fun. It's stressful, frustrating, exhausting. But by other metrics, meaningfulness, intensity, emotional authenticity, it's profoundly engaging. The disconnect comes from fundamentally different expectations about what games should provide. People who love Outlast aren't playing for fun in the sense of relaxation or entertainment. They're playing for validation, for processed trauma, for the specific catharsis of surviving simulated helplessness. When they finish a play session, they don't feel satisfied like they've had fun. They feel exhausted like they've done necessary work. This creates communication barriers with other gamers who can't understand why anyone would repeatedly subject themselves to something so unpleasant. But that's the point. The unpleasantness is the feature, not the bug. The battery mechanic specifically becomes a lightning rod for this divide. Most players hate it. They find it interrupts flow, forces tedious exploration, adds artificial challenge. But people who connect with Outlast defend it fiercely. The constant scarcity, the anxiety of running out, the need to choose between seeing clearly and conserving resources, This isn't bad design to them. It's the design that makes the game work psychologically. Remove the battery limitation, and you remove the resource anxiety that mirrors trauma survival. You remove the forced decisions between safety and blindness. You remove the mechanical manifestation of never having enough. The controversy around the asylum setting and mental illness representation reveals complicated psychology in the fan base. Critics point out that setting horror games in asylums reinforces stigma against mental illness, that it codes mentally ill people as dangerous, that it exploits psychiatric suffering for entertainment. These criticisms have merit. The imagery of asylums as horror settings does rely on and potentially reinforces negative stereotypes. But Outlast fans often argue that the game is actually critical of institutions, not of patients, that the variants are victims, not villains, that the true horror is what Murkoff did to these people, not the people themselves, that the game shows how institutional abuse creates the conditions for violence. This reading has merit too. The files you collect consistently show how every variant was a person before becoming a threat, how their current state results from what was done to them. The truth is probably that both readings exist simultaneously. The game does criticize institutional abuse while also using asylum imagery that activates cultural stigma. It does present variants as victims while also making them function as threats. The question is which reading you foreground, and that often depends on your own relationship with psychiatric institutions. People with positive or neutral experiences tend to see the stigmatizing elements more clearly. People with traumatic experiences in psychiatric settings tend to see the institutional critique more clearly. There's a particular type of person drawn to Outlast who has experience with both being victimized and being perceived as threatening. People who understand that trauma makes you dangerous sometimes, that your fear responses can harm others, that your triggered states can frighten people, that your survival mechanisms look like aggression. The variants represent this dual reality. They're suffering and they're threatening. They're victims and they're dangers. They're people broken by what was done to them, and they're breaking others in turn. For fans who recognize this dynamic in themselves, the variants aren't just enemies to hide from. They're warnings about what unprocessed trauma does. Chris Walker's specific characterization matters here. His files reveal he was a soldier with PTSD who sought treatment at Mount Massive. He was trying to get help. The institution that was supposed to treat him turned him into a test subject, and the experiment shattered his already damaged psyche. His current state, hunting through the asylum trying to kill everyone because he believes he's still a soldier protecting his unit, represents how seeking help can lead to worse harm. For veterans with PTSD who've had negative experiences with VA systems, who've been institutionalized against their will, who've sought treatment only to be traumatized further, Chris Walker's story hits devastatingly close to home. The morphogenic engine's appearance matters too. It's a massive mechanical device with biofeedback tubes, monitoring equipment, suspension systems. It looks like torture equipment disguised as medical technology. Or perhaps more accurately, it reveals how medical technology becomes torture equipment when used unethically. The engine doesn't look alien or incomprehensible. It looks like something that could exist, that probably does exist in some form, that corporations with enough money and lack of ethics could absolutely build and use on vulnerable people. This mundane plausibility makes the horror more immediate. Red Barrels didn't create fantasy nightmare machines. They created exaggerated versions of real technology, biofeedback, lucid dream manipulation, nanite swarms. These things exist in research labs. The game just pushes them to horrifying conclusions. For people who distrust pharmaceutical companies, who fear medical research that treats humans as data, who understand how often therapy and treatment become excuses for experimentation on vulnerable populations. The morphogenic engine isn't science fiction, it's prediction. The way Outlast handles death differs significantly from most horror games. You die frequently. Deaths are often sudden and graphic, but they're not exactly punishing. Checkpoints are fairly generous. You respawn close to where you died. The game wants you to see all the death animations, wants you to experience failure repeatedly, wants death to be a regular part of the experience rather than something to avoid at all costs. This creates a relationship with in-game death that mirrors how trauma survivors relate to their own close calls with mortality. Death stops being the worst outcome and becomes just another thing that happens. You see your various death animations so many times they lose shock value. Getting grabbed by Chris Walker and having your head crushed becomes almost routine. Richard Traeger's Saw becomes a familiar failure state. The game normalizes violent death in ways that should be disturbing, but instead create a strange numbness. And that numbness itself becomes commentary on how trauma makes you weirdly casual about mortality, on how proximity to violence changes your relationship with physical vulnerability. The Whistleblower DLC's additional context about Waylon being the whistleblower who started everything adds a layer of guilt to his survival. He's not just escaping personal danger, he's escaping horror. He helped expose but also helped create. He maintained the morphogenic engine. He was part of the system. His eventual rebellion doesn't erase his complicity. This complicated moral position resonates with people who have been part of harmful systems, who've worked for institutions that cause damage, who've had to grapple with their own role in structures they eventually rejected. Waylon gets to survive, but he doesn't get to be innocent. He was a whistleblower, which is morally admirable, but he was also complicit for years before his conscience activated. His survival isn't heroic rescue. It's the specific relief of someone who was drowning and managed to grab something floating, regardless of whether they deserved rescue more than others still drowning. For people carrying guilt about their own survival, about times they were complicit in harm, about how long it took them to do the right thing, Waylon represents the uncomfortable reality that you can be both victim and participant, that survival doesn't require moral purity. The game's sound design deserves specific attention for how it contributes to psychological impact. The distant screaming, the industrial grinding, the wet sounds of footsteps in blood-soaked corridors, the specific audio cues for each enemy type, but most importantly, the sound of your own panicked breathing. Miles gasps when he runs. He hyperventilates when hiding. His breath catches when injured. The game forces you to listen to your character's fear, makes you hear his physiological panic response. This audio design implicates your body in the experience. You're not just moving an avatar through spaces, you're listening to someone experience terror, and that listening activates your own fear responses. The breathing is particularly effective because it's something you can't control but can only hear. You can't make Miles calm down. You can't regulate his breathing. You can only listen to his panic and feel your own increase in sympathetic response. For people who've experienced panic attacks, who know what it sounds like to lose control of your breathing, this audio design is almost unbearably accurate. The asylum's environmental storytelling, the bloodstains that reveal violence patterns, the scattered belongings that suggest individual lives, the blocked or destroyed exits that show how escape was systematically prevented, creates a geography of trauma. You're not just navigating a building, you're reading a space that's been marked by suffering. Every corridor tells a story. Every room reveals something about what happened here. The building itself becomes a witness to its own history of harm. For people who relate to spaces holding trauma, houses where abuse happened, institutions where they were harmed, locations marked by violence, this environmental storytelling resonates powerfully. Spaces remember. Geography holds suffering. You can feel it in certain rooms, in specific configurations. Mount Massive's environmental design captures the sense of space marked by trauma, of buildings that carry the weight of what happened in them. The debate about jump scares in Outlast reveals interesting divisions even among people who love the game. Some defend the jump scares as effective fear tools. Others argue they're cheap tactics that undermine the atmospheric dread. But the jump scares in Outlast function differently than in many horror games. They're not random or disconnected from narrative. They usually involve enemies you've been tracking or hiding from suddenly appearing. The scare comes from the thing you were afraid of actually finding you. This makes them psychologically different from FNAF-style jump scares, where threat appears from nowhere with no build-up. Outlast jump scares are fear payoff rather than fear replacement. You were already afraid. You were already hiding. The jump scare is the moment your fear becomes reality. You got caught. For people whose trauma involves anticipation followed by realization, this structure mirrors their psychological experience. The jump scare isn't the introduction of fear. It's fear's culmination. The way enemies patrol and search creates sustained anxiety that's arguably more psychologically intense than the jump scares themselves. Hearing Chris Walker's heavy footsteps, watching his massive silhouette search the area while you're crammed in a locker, barely breathing, that experience of sustained, near discovery, of almost being caught, of maintaining stillness while everything in you screams to run. This is where Outlast's real psychological horror lives. For people who've hidden from abusers, who've made themselves small while danger searched for them, who've experienced the specific terror of knowing that if you're discovered, something terrible will happen. These hiding sequences aren't gameplay mechanics, they're reenactments, and the compulsion to replay Outlast, despite knowing it will be terrifying, comes partly from this need to reenact hiding, to practice survival, to repeatedly put yourself in the position of being hunted and surviving it. It's exposure therapy you conduct on yourself. The revelation about Billy Hope's condition, that he's been in a lucid vegetative state for years, conscious but unable to move or communicate, kept alive by machinery while the morphogenic engine uses his brain, represents perhaps the darkest element of Outlast's horror. He's trapped in his own body, aware of everything happening to him, unable to consent or resist. The wall rider grew from his suffering, fed on his consciousness, eventually merged with him until the distinction between Billy and wall rider became meaningless. This specific horror of being trapped in a body you can't control, of consciousness without agency, of being used without consent in ways you're aware of but powerless to prevent, resonates with multiple types of trauma. Medical trauma where your body is treated as object rather than self. Sexual trauma where your body is used against your will. Dissociative experiences where consciousness and embodiment disconnect. Billy's fate represents the nightmare scenario of awareness without ability to act, of suffering you can't escape or even fully express. The ending where Miles becomes the new Wall Rider host suggests this fate is transferable, that the witness becomes the thing witnessed, that investigating horror deeply enough means being consumed by it. This isn't just plot twist, it's psychological truth. When you immerse yourself in trauma, studying it, documenting it, trying to expose it, There's a risk of becoming so merged with the subject that you lose yourself. The wall rider doesn't just possess you, it is you now. Your consciousness becomes the framework it uses to operate. You don't die exactly. You transform into something that uses your identity as an interface. For people who feel their trauma has consumed their identity, who can't tell anymore where their personality ends and their damage begins, who've become so merged with their suffering that they don't remember who they were before, Miles becoming the wall rider hits as tragedy and recognition simultaneously. This is what happens when you look too deep. This is what happens when you can't stop investigating. This is what happens when bearing witness becomes your entire identity. You don't just document the horror, you become it. The Murkoff Corporation itself deserves analysis as antagonist. You never fight Murkoff directly. You never confront executives or scientists. You only see the aftermath of their decisions, the destroyed lives, the shattered minds, the institutional mechanisms still running on autopilot long after the people who built them have fled. Murkoff appears in files, in scattered documents, in bureaucratic traces. The horror is structural, systemic, impersonal. This makes Murkoff more frightening than any individual villain could be. There's no boss to defeat. There's no architect of suffering you can confront. There's just a corporation that did evil things for profit, that will continue operating under new names, that can't be stopped by exposing one facility because it exists as structure rather than people. For anyone who's tried to seek accountability from institutions, who's discovered that exposing individual bad actors doesn't dismantle harmful systems, that corporations outlive consequences, that structural evil can't be defeated by just removing visible villains. Murkoff represents that specific frustration. The radio towers and experiments from Outlast 2, which reveal Murkoff's continued operation and evolution of their psychological warfare technology, confirm that exposing Mount Massive didn't stop them. They learned from those experiments. They refined their approach. They moved from physical facilities to broadcast manipulation. The corporation adapted to accountability the way viruses adapt to vaccines, by evolving past it. This isn't pessimism exactly. It's realism about how power insulates itself from consequences. When people say they love Outlast, they're often not talking about loving the experience of playing it. They're talking about loving what it understands, loving that it doesn't flinch from representing helplessness, loving that it takes institutional horror seriously, loving that it shows how victims and threats aren't clean categories, loving that it refuses to provide you with weapons or power or control because sometimes that's not realistic or helpful, loving that it says sometimes you can't fight back, and that doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're in a situation where fighting back isn't possible. The psychology of people who love Outlast is the psychology of people who need their powerlessness validated, who need art that says, yes, sometimes you can't do anything except survive, and survival is enough, who need horror that matches their actual lived experience of fear rather than fantasy versions of overcoming it, who need games that don't lie to them about agency and control and empowerment because those lies hurt more than help. When someone loads up Outlast for another playthrough, when they willingly subject themselves to terror they've already experienced, when they guide newcomers through Mount Massive with the intensity of someone sharing something sacred, they're not just playing a horror game. They're returning to a space that saw them clearly. They're practicing survival in controlled conditions. They're finding language for experiences that don't have words. They're building evidence that their suffering was real and deserves documentation. They're bearing witness to their own need to bear witness. Outlast doesn't offer hope or healing or catharsis in traditional senses. It offers recognition of what survival without power looks like. And sometimes when you've been powerless, when you've hidden in closets, literal or metaphorical, when you've barely escaped with evidence that no one believes anyway, sometimes recognition is enough. Sometimes a game that takes your helplessness seriously means more than 100 games that let you be a hero. The person who loves Outlast isn't looking for fun. They're looking for truth. Truth about institutions that harm. Truth about victims who become threats. Truth about how you can't fight some horrors. You can only document them and hope you survive long enough for anyone to care. Truth about how bodies remember trauma even when minds try to forget. Truth about how consciousness and identity can be hijacked by suffering until you don't know who you were before it all began. Understanding the psychology of people who love Outlast means understanding that art doesn't have to provide escape or empowerment to be valuable. Sometimes it provides something more important, accurate representation of how terrible things actually feel, not sanitized or gamified or made palatable, but raw and honest and almost unbearably real. Red Barrels created a game that doesn't let you win in any satisfying way, that strips you of agency, that forces you to witness horror you can't prevent, that documents institutional evil you can't stop. And certain people needed exactly that. Needed someone to create art that doesn't flinch. Needed a game that treats survival of helplessness as achievement rather than failure. Needed Mount Massive to exist so they could walk its halls and recognize their own experience in its blood-stained corridors. For those who love Outlast, the asylum isn't just a setting. It's a diagram of their own psychological landscape. The battery isn't just a mechanic. It's the exhausting economics of trauma, survival. The camera isn't just a tool. It's a desperate need for evidence. The variants aren't just enemies. They're mirrors showing what unprocessed suffering looks like. And Miles's fate isn't just a plot twist. It's the recognition that bearing witness to horror can mean being consumed by it. They return to Mount Massive because nowhere else validates what they know, because no other game takes their specific fears seriously, because Outlast speaks a language most media refuses to acknowledge exists, the language of institutional betrayal, the language of helplessness, the language of survival without victory, the language of documentation without justice, the language of witnessing horror because someone has to, even when it costs everything. This isn't pathology, it's recognition, and recognition, even of terrible things, is what certain people need most. The community that forms around Outlast reveals its own fascinating psychology, one markedly different from other horror game communities. These aren't people bonding over speedrun strategies or optimal routing. They're not comparing skill levels or debating which difficulty is true Outlast. Instead, they bond over shared reactions to specific moments, over which death animation disturbed them most, over whether they could finish Eddie Gluskin's section in one sitting or had to take breaks, over how long it took them to realize Chris Walker couldn't actually get into certain hiding spots even though it feels like he can. This community builds itself around vulnerability rather than mastery. Admitting you were terrified isn't weakness, it's the expected response. Confessing you had to pause the game during certain sections isn't shameful, it's understood. The shared experience isn't, I beat this challenge, but I survived this horror. And that distinction creates a different social dynamic entirely. People don't compete about who handled Outlast better. They commiserate about how badly it affected them, and the worse it affected you, the more you're understood to have truly engaged with it. This creates interesting gatekeeping dynamics. When someone claims Outlast wasn't scary, the community doesn't just disagree. They question whether that person actually played it properly. Did they play in the dark? Did they use headphones? Did they actually try to immerse themselves? Or did they maintain ironic distance? Because Outlast only works if you allow it to work. If you play it casually, with lights on, half paying attention, treating it like any other game, it loses most of its power. The horror requires participation. It requires making yourself vulnerable to it. This creates a divide between people who got it and people who didn't, and the ones who got it can become intensely protective of their experience. When someone dismisses Outlast as just another jump scare game, fans hear an invalidation of the psychological work they did while playing it. When someone says, "It's not that scary," fans interpret it as that person refusing to engage with vulnerability, protecting themselves through emotional distance, choosing not to understand. But here's where it gets complicated. This protectiveness can become exclusionary. New fans trying to enter the community sometimes face tests: prove you actually played it, prove you understand the lore, prove you experienced it the right way. The community that formed around shared vulnerability starts policing who's vulnerable enough to belong, and people who had different reactions, who found certain sections less frightening, who focused on lore rather than terror, who analyzed mechanics rather than being consumed by atmosphere, can find themselves dismissed as not real fans. The obsession with playing it right, lights off, headphones on, alone, at night, reveals how much Outlast fans understand that fear requires specific conditions. They're not wrong that context affects experience. Playing Outlast in broad daylight on a phone with no sound is fundamentally different from playing it in isolation with full audio immersion. But the insistence on these conditions also suggests anxiety that the experience might not hold up without them, that maybe the horror requires such specific circumstances that it's actually fragile. This anxiety manifests in how fans discuss Outlast with potential newcomers. They carefully orchestrate first experiences. They refuse to provide warnings about specific content because you need to go in blind. They insist on specific hardware and environmental conditions. They're creating the conditions for maximum impact. Yes, but they're also controlling the experience in ways that mirror how they themselves need to control engagement with trauma. You have to encounter it exactly right, or the encounter doesn't count. The relationship between Outlast fans and Red Barrels as developers differs significantly from most game fandom relationships. There's a specific type of trust involved, a belief that Red Barrels understands something about suffering and vulnerability that most developers don't. The Outlast Trials, the multiplayer entry, tested this trust in interesting ways. Could the formula work with multiple players? Could you maintain the vulnerability and helplessness when you had allies? Would adding teammates fundamentally change the psychology of the experience? Fan reactions to Trials revealed the community's divided relationship with companionship in horror. Some felt that having other players made it less scary. The vulnerability requires isolation, that the core experience got diluted when you could coordinate with teammates. Others found new horror in trying to stay together while being hunted, in watching teammates get grabbed while you hide, in the guilt of surviving when others didn't. The debate wasn't really about game mechanics. It was about whether fear and trauma are inherently isolating experiences, or whether shared suffering can be equally valid. The Cold War setting of Trials, the shift from Mount Massive's medical horror to Murkoff's behavior modification experiments in the 1950s and 60s, expanded the franchise's psychological territory. It revealed that Murkoff's evil wasn't modern aberration but historical pattern, that the corporation had been perfecting these techniques for decades. that Mount Massive was refinement of methods tested on Cold War subjects. This historical depth added weight to the horror. This wasn't isolated incident, but systematic program spanning generations. For fans who connect Outlast to real historical abuses, MKUltra, Tuskegee, the countless documented cases of institutions experimenting on vulnerable populations, Trials' Cold War setting confirmed what they already suspected, that Red Barrels was drawing from actual historical horror, that Murkoff was composite of real entities that did real harm, that the games weren't exploitation but exposure. This historical grounding matters to fans who need to believe the horror they're engaging with is meaningful rather than gratuitous, that it's commentary rather than just spectacle. The files and lore documents scattered throughout Outlast games serve crucial functions for the devoted fan base. They provide the evidence that Miles is gathering, yes, but they also provide the community with shared texts to analyze and interpret. Fans pore over these documents, extract timelines, build wikis, create comprehensive lore explanations. This archival impulse, this need to organize and document and make sense of the horror, mirrors Miles's own journalistic mission. The community becomes collective investigator. Each player gathers pieces of the puzzle, shares them, collaborates on comprehensive understanding. The files reward close reading and careful attention. They reveal character backstories, corporate motivations, experimental outcomes. They provide context that transforms variants from obstacles into tragedies. Knowing that Chris Walker was seeking treatment for PTSD changes how you understand him. Learning about Eddie Gluskin's history of abuse recontextualizes his violence. The files don't excuse the horror, but they explain it, and that explanation provides the meaning that makes the horror bearable. This lore obsession serves another purpose. It provides intellectual engagement with material that would be emotionally overwhelming if engaged with purely viscerally. By analyzing files, debating timeline placement, discussing Walrider mechanics, fans create distance from direct emotional impact while still remaining engaged with the material. It's a form of processing that feels safer than pure emotional immersion. You can discuss Murkoff's experimental methodology without directly confronting how it feels to be hunted through the sewers by Chris Walker. The parallel conversations happening in Outlast fandom, one about lore and mechanics, another about personal impact and fear, rarely intersect completely. Some fans stay entirely in lore discussion, treating the games as puzzles to solve. Others focus entirely on emotional impact, sharing how specific moments affected them. The fans who can move between both registers, who can analyze the timeline while also discussing how Angela's death affected them, often become community leaders. They provide the bridge between intellectual and emotional engagement. The relationship with Outlast 2 reveals complicated dynamics in the fan base. The second game shifted settings from asylum to rural Arizona, from Murkoff experiments to religious cult horror, from corporate evil to faith-based violence. The protagonist changed from investigative journalist to cameraman searching for his wife. The core mechanics remained: vulnerability, documentation, hiding, but the context transformed entirely. Fan reaction split. Some embraced the expansion of thematic territory, the willingness to explore religious trauma alongside institutional trauma. Others felt it diffuse focus, that moving away from Mount Massive lost something essential. The debate often correlated with personal experience. People with religious trauma history tended to connect more deeply with Outlast 2, while those whose trauma came from institutional sources preferred the first game's setting. Blake Langerman, Outlast 2's protagonist, differs psychologically from Miles in important ways. Miles investigates horror professionally, maintaining journalist objectivity until he can't anymore. Blake searches for his wife Lynn, motivated by personal connection rather than professional duty. Miles has nothing to protect except his documentation. Blake has someone he's trying to save. This changes the emotional calculus of survival. Blake's not just trying to escape, he's trying to reach Lynn, protect her, get them both out. His survival has purpose beyond documentation. For players whose trauma involves failing to protect loved ones, Blake's desperate search hits differently than Miles's investigation. Every time you're separated from Lynn, every time you watch her suffer, every setback in reaching her registers as failure of protection. The game repeatedly puts you in positions where you can't help her, can't reach her, can't save her from what's happening. And the ending, which reveals complex truths about Lynn's pregnancy and fate, denies you even the consolation of successful rescue. The religious cult setting, led by the delusional prophet Gnoth, represents different institutional horror than Mount Massive. This isn't corporate evil implemented through bureaucratic mechanisms. It's communal evil enforced through faith and fear. Noth believes the apocalypse is coming, that babies born in the community carry the Antichrist, that murdering these children prevents end times. His followers enact horrific violence believing they're serving God. The horror shifts from what corporations do to individuals to what communities do to themselves. For people with religious trauma, particularly from apocalyptic or fundamentalist backgrounds, this setting provides rare representation. Most horror either ignores religion or treats it as straightforward evil. Outlast 2 shows how faith becomes weapon, how belief enables atrocity, how communities police themselves through theological terror. It shows children raised in systems that teach them their births were sins, women made to believe their bodies house evil, men convinced their violence serves righteousness. The school flashback sequences where Blake remembers his childhood friend Jessica and the abuse she suffered from Father Loudermilch provide crucial context for understanding Blake's psychology. These sections aren't just backstory, they're Blake's own trauma, bleeding through his present horror. Jessica's fall down the stairs, whether accident or escape from abuse, haunts Blake. He carries guilt about not protecting her, about not understanding what was happening, about being child when child couldn't have changed outcomes. These flashbacks create layered horror. You're not just escaping cult violence. In present timeline, you're processing childhood trauma that Blake never resolved. The game suggests that Blake's current experience triggers his unprocessed memories, that the cult's horrors resonate with horrors he witnessed as child. This psychological structure, present trauma activating old trauma, current powerlessness echoing childhood powerlessness, mirrors how trauma actually works. It's not linear. New horrors reach back and activate old ones until you can't tell which timeline you're surviving. For players who understand this non-linear quality of trauma, who've experienced how present suffering pulls forward past suffering until everything blurs together, Outlast 2's structure validates that experience. The flashbacks aren't just narrative device, they're accurate representation of how trauma collapses time, how you're simultaneously adult surviving current danger and child reliving past danger. Lynn's mysterious pregnancy and the revelation about what's actually happening, that Murkoff is using radio towers to broadcast signals that create mass hallucination and hysteria, recontextualizes everything. The cult exists, but not as Blake perceives it. The horror he's experiencing is partially real and partially signal-induced hallucination. The birth at the end happens, but what exactly happens remains deliberately ambiguous. The game refuses clean answers, about what was real and what was induced. This ambiguity frustrates players who want concrete lore explanations, but it serves crucial psychological purpose. Trauma makes you question reality. It makes you unsure what actually happened versus what you perceived happening. Outlast 2's refusal to clearly separate reality from hallucination mirrors this destabilized relationship with truth. Blake experienced horror. Whether all details happened as he perceived doesn't change that he suffered, that Lynn died, that he's left holding something that might be his child in the ruins of his sanity. For fans who've had their reality questioned, who've been told their memories are wrong, their perceptions mistaken, their understanding of events inaccurate, this ambiguity hits as validation rather than frustration. The game says, it doesn't matter if every detail was real, your suffering was real. The distinction between actual and perceived doesn't minimize the trauma of experience. The debate about whether Outlast 2 is really an Outlast game reveals community anxieties about franchise identity. Does Outlast require asylum settings? Does it need Murkoff as direct antagonist rather than background entity? Does it have to follow Miles's fate, or can it explore other characters? These questions don't have objective answers, but how fans answer them reveals what they think Outlast is fundamentally about. Fans who define Outlast by setting and corporate antagonist often reject or diminish Outlast 2. Fans who define it by themes of vulnerability, documentation, and institutional horror embrace the expansion. The divide isn't really about quality, it's about what elements are essential to the experience they need. Someone whose trauma came from medical institutions might need Mount Massive specifically. Someone whose trauma came from religious contexts might need Temple Gate. Both are valid needs, but they lead to different relationships with franchise continuity. The trials of growing the Outlast community reveal similar tensions. As more people play the games, as the fan base expands, the community experiences typical growing pains. Early fans who discovered Outlast when it was niche feel protective of it. They remember when loving Outlast meant being part of a small community that really understood. Newer fans encounter a more established fandom with developed lore, established interpretations, inside jokes they missed. The natural tension between old and new fans gets amplified because the emotional stakes of Outlast fandom run higher than in many communities. When an early fan says, you had to be there for the first playthrough when nobody knew what to expect, they're not just being gatekeeping, they're mourning the loss of that specific discovery experience. When a new fan pushes back against established lore interpretations, they're not just offering fresh perspective, they're asserting their right to have their own relationship with the material. Both positions are valid, but they create friction because Outlast's horror is so personal that different interpretations feel like competing claims about what's real. The modding community around Outlast on PC reveals another dimension of fandom psychology. People create custom maps, new variants, altered enemy behaviors. But unlike many game modding scenes that focus on making games easier or more convenient, Outlast modders often make the game harder, scarier, more unforgiving. They remove more batteries, they make enemies faster, they create scenarios with no hiding spots. They're intensifying the suffering because the baseline suffering isn't quite enough anymore. This escalation reveals how exposure affects fear response. The fifth time Chris Walker crashes through a wall, it's less frightening than the first. The horror requires constant intensification to maintain impact. But this escalation also suggests something about pain tolerance and trauma processing. People who've survived real horror have high thresholds for fictional horror, so they need intensity most players would find unbearable just to feel anything. The mods become way to chase that initial impact, to try recreating the fear of first playthrough when you didn't know what was coming. Speed running Outlast presents interesting psychological contradictions. Speedrunning typically involves mastery, optimization, perfect execution, all things antithetical to vulnerability and helplessness. Yet Outlast speedrunning exists and has dedicated community. These runners have learned enemy patterns so perfectly they can navigate Mount Massive with precision most players never achieve. They've transformed experience of terror into experience of mastery. This transformation reveals a path some fans take through trauma processing. First playthrough is pure immersion in vulnerability. Subsequent playthroughs begin pattern recognition. Eventually, you've mastered the system enough that you're no longer vulnerable. You're performing vulnerability while actually having complete control. Speed running becomes ultimate expression of this. You've conquered the horror so thoroughly you can race through it. Whether this represents healing or avoidance depends on individual psychology. The relationship between Outlast fans and Let's Play content reveals another layer of community dynamics. Watching other people play Outlast for first time becomes entertainment for experienced fans. They vicariously experience that initial terror through newcomers' reactions. They anticipate scares the new player doesn't see coming. They watch for the moments that got them. Will this player be as terrified by the underground water section? Will Eddie's workshop affect them the same way? This voyeuristic pleasure in others' fear might seem sadistic, but it's more complex than that. Fans aren't enjoying others' suffering for cruelty's sake. They're seeking validation that their own fear was reasonable, that the game affects others similarly, that their vulnerability wasn't weakness but appropriate response. When a Let's Player screams at the same moment they did, it confirms their experience. It creates community through shared fear response, even when that sharing happens asynchronously through video content. The criticism that Outlast relies too heavily on chase sequences deserves examination because it reveals what different players need from horror. Critics argue that being chased becomes repetitive, that the hiding mechanics grow stale, that the game lacks enemy variety. These criticisms assume horror should constantly introduce new threats and mechanics. But for fans who connect deeply with Outlast, the repetition is the point. Trauma is repetitive. The same threats circle back. You hide from the same dangers over and over. Your nightmares don't feature new monsters each night. They feature the same horrors in slight variations. The repetitive structure of Outlast's chase sequences mirrors this psychological reality. Chris Walker hunting you multiple times isn't poor enemy variety. It's accurate representation of how specific threats haunt you repeatedly. The repetition creates familiarity with fear, which is how exposure therapy works. You face the same horror until it loses some power, or until you understand it so deeply you can't face anything else. The sections where you're injured, limping, moving slower, these forced vulnerability moments that limit player control further generate complaints from action game fans, but resonate with trauma survivors. When you're hurt, your capacity for self-protection diminishes. You can't run as fast. You can't hide as effectively. Your options narrow precisely when danger increases. This isn't poor game design. It's realistic simulation of how injury compounds vulnerability. The persistent criticism that Outlast is walking simulator with hiding misunderstands what the game provides. Yes, mechanically you walk, run, hide, and occasionally crouch walk. The verb set is limited compared to games with combat, puzzles, platforming. but reducing Outlast to its mechanical verbs misses that the core verb is witness. You are witnessing horror. The walking is conveyance to next, witnessing opportunity. The hiding is survival between witnessing moments. The game is structured around bearing witness to atrocity you cannot prevent or change, only document. For players whose verb set in real trauma was similarly limited, who could only witness, who could only survive, who couldn't fight or solve or change what was happening. This limited mechanical vocabulary is validation, not limitation. The game says your limited options were real, not failure of your imagination or courage. Sometimes witness and survival are the only verbs available. The discourse around Outlast's treatment of female characters, particularly the whistleblower DLC's Eddie Gluskin section and its sexual violence implications, reveals complicated politics in the community. Critics argue the game exploits sexual violence for shock value, that it treats women's bodies as horror props, that it's gratuitous. Defenders argue the horror is meant to be disturbing, that it takes sexual violence seriously rather than trivializing it, that depicting horror isn't endorsing it. The truth involves recognizing that trauma representation affects people differently based on their experiences. For some survivors, Eddie's section is validating. It takes the threat seriously, doesn't sexualize it, treats it as horror rather than titillation. For others, it's triggering or exploitative. It uses sexual violence as plot device, focuses on male protagonist's fear rather than female victims' experiences, doesn't provide adequate warnings. Both responses are legitimate. The question isn't whether the content is objectively appropriate, but whether it serves psychological purpose beyond shock. For fans who connect with it, Eddie's section represents rare acknowledgement that sexual violence is horror, not romance subplot or character development tool. For fans troubled by it, the section represents using women's suffering as set dressing for male protagonist's journey. The community's inability to resolve this debate stems from different needs around trauma representation. The environmental design of specific sections reveals psychological sophistication often overlooked. The underground laboratory's sterile medical horror, the prison blocks, constrained violence, the shower's vulnerability and exposure, the cafeteria's perverted domesticity. Each space activates different fear associations. The shower room section particularly demonstrates this. Showers are spaces of enforced nudity and vulnerability. In institutions, they're sites of surveillance and assault. The game uses this cultural knowledge without explanation. You feel exposed in the shower section even though Miles remains clothed. For people with institutional trauma, particularly from contexts where shower time meant vulnerability to staff or other inmates, this section doesn't require explicit violence to be horrifying. The space itself carries threat. Similarly, the cafeteria perverted from dining hall to cannibal's lair inverts domestic safety. These environmental inversions work on deep psychological levels, activating primal fears about spaces that should provide care becoming sites of harm. The debate about whether Outlast respects mental illness or exploits it for horror continues to divide both critics and fans. The game depicts psych patients as threats, uses asylum imagery that activates stigma, codes mental illness as dangerous. These elements exist and cause real harm in terms of cultural stigma. But the game also shows every variant as victim first, provides backstory humanizing them, places blame clearly on corporate experimentation rather than pre-existing conditions. Fans with mental illness themselves often fall on both sides of this debate. Some feel seen by the game's institutional critique, validated by its representation of medical trauma. understood in its depiction of how systems break people. Others feel harmed by the stigmatizing imagery, frustrated that their experiences become horror entertainment, tired of mental illness being shorthand for danger. The community can't resolve this tension because it requires reconciling the game's genuine institutional critique with its use of harmful tropes. What makes this debate particularly intense in Outlast fandom is that many fans are themselves mentally ill and have experienced institutional harm. They're not outside observers debating representation in abstract. They're directly affected by both the game's critique and its problematic elements. This creates more nuanced but also more emotionally charged discourse than in fandoms where most participants don't share the marginalization being depicted. The relationship between Outlast fans and the concept of fun in horror deserves deeper examination. When someone says, "I love Outlast," most people assume they mean, "I have fun playing Outlast." But fans often mean something closer to, "Outlast provides something I need," or "Outlast does important psychological work for me." The experience might be valuable without being enjoyable, meaningful without being pleasant, necessary without being desired. This distinction confuses people outside the fandom. Why play something that makes you miserable? Why subject yourself to stress and fear and discomfort? The answer involves understanding that some psychological needs aren't met through pleasant experiences. Sometimes you need art that validates your suffering rather than distracts from it. Sometimes you need media that takes your vulnerability seriously rather than empowering you past it. Sometimes you need horror that matches your actual experience of fear rather than fantasy versions you can overcome. The community that forms around this shared understanding becomes fiercely protective because so few spaces validate these needs. Most gaming culture celebrates power fantasy, skill expression, achievement, overcoming challenges. Outlast offers none of that. It offers accurate representation of powerlessness, which gaming culture generally treats as failure state to overcome. For fans who need that specific offering, Outlast becomes irreplaceable. No other major horror game removes agency so completely. No other franchise leans so hard into helplessness as core design principle. This irreplaceability creates anxiety about the franchise's future. Red Barrel's a small studio. Outlast isn't massive commercial success. Each new entry's viability depends on previous entry sales. Fans worry that declining interest could end the franchise. The Trials multiplayer focus suggests moving away from the single-player vulnerability that made the series work. That mainstream gaming's preference for action means Outlast will always be niche and therefore precarious. These anxieties manifest in fierce defense of the games, in over-explaining their value to skeptics, in desperate evangelizing to potential new fans. The community knows Outlast serves specific psychological needs that most games don't address. They know that if the franchise dies, nothing will replace it. Not because it's the best horror game by objective metrics, but because it's the only horror game doing this specific thing this specifically. Their intensity comes from protecting something they can't afford to lose. The experience of finishing Outlast for first time creates specific psychological aftermath. Unlike games where beating the final boss produces triumph and satisfaction, finishing Outlast produces different emotional cocktail, relief that it's over, emptiness about what you witnessed, disturbance at Miles's fate, lingering dread that doesn't easily dissipate. You don't feel accomplished. You feel survivor's guilt about fictional character and exhaustion from sustained terror. This aftermath often drives immediate community engagement. Players finish Outlast and immediately seek out others to process the experience with. They need to talk about what they just went through, need validation that others felt similarly, need to make sense of the ending's implications. The community becomes debriefing space, place where you can process virtual trauma with people who understand why virtual trauma needs processing. This might seem melodramatic. It's just a game. Why does it need processing? But the brain's fear responses don't distinguish between real and simulated threats during immersed gameplay. Your body floods with stress hormones. Your nervous system activates fight or flight. The trauma isn't real, but the fear is. And sustained fear over many hours of gameplay creates genuine physiological impact that takes time to recover from. The community validates that recovery process rather than dismissing it. Understanding the psychology of people who love Outlast ultimately means recognizing that horror serves different purposes for different people. For some, it's thrill-seeking and adrenaline. For others, it's aesthetic appreciation of craft and atmosphere. But for Outlast's core fan base, horror is validation. It's recognition. It's proof that their experiences of powerlessness and institutional betrayal and sustained terror are real enough to be represented in art. They don't love Outlast despite its refusal to empower them. They love it because of that refusal. Because empowerment fantasy, when you've been genuinely powerless, feels like lie. Because games that give you weapons and tell you to fight back, when your trauma involved situations where fighting back would have gotten you killed, feel like victim blaming. Because horror that you can defeat through skill and persistence, when your trauma was undefeatable and permanent, feels like trivializing what you survived. Outlast doesn't lie. It says sometimes you're just trying to survive. Sometimes all you can do is document what's happening and hope you live to show someone. Sometimes the institution that promised help becomes the source of harm. Sometimes witnesses become victims, become threats in cycle you can't break. Sometimes you escape physically but carry what happened inside you forever. Sometimes consciousness itself becomes trapped you can't escape. These truths are uncomfortable. They don't make for satisfying gameplay by conventional standards. They don't provide catharsis or closure or growth arcs, but they provide something else, acknowledgement that these experiences exist, that people survive them, that survival without victory is still survival. For fans who needed exactly that acknowledgement, Outlast becomes more than game. It becomes witness to their own need to witness, documentation of their need to document, evidence that their evidence-gathering impulse is valid. The person who's replayed Outlast 6 times, who's collected every document, who's analyzed every variant's backstory, who can explain the full extent of Murkoff's crimes, that person isn't obsessed. They're bearing witness. They're doing the psychological work Miles couldn't finish. They're ensuring someone understands what happened in Mount Massive, in Temple Gate, in the Trials facility. They're fulfilling the documentary impulse the games instill, making sure the suffering wasn't meaningless by understanding it fully. When they defend Outlast design choices to skeptics, when they explain why removing the battery mechanic would ruin the experience, when they argue that helplessness is feature rather than bug, they're not being difficult. They're protecting something that protected them. They're defending art that took their vulnerability seriously when most media tells them to be stronger. They're ensuring that space continues existing, where survival without fighting back is respected as legitimate response to overwhelming threat. The psychology of loving Outlast is psychology of needing your powerlessness validated, of requiring art that doesn't flinch from depicting institutional evil, of finding language in gameplay mechanics for experiences that resist verbal articulation, of building community around shared vulnerability rather than shared mastery, of understanding that sometimes the most important thing art can do is say, yes, that's what it feels like. You're not imagining it. Your fear was appropriate. Your survival matters even though you couldn't fight back. It's the psychology of people who walk willingly into virtual asylums because their real ones couldn't be documented, couldn't be believed, couldn't be escaped. People who hide in digital lockers because they've hidden in real ones. People who run from virtual threats because they've run from real ones and need to practice survival somewhere it can't kill them. People who bear witness through Miles's camera because no one witnessed for them. Red Barrels didn't just make horror games. They made validation machines for a specific type of trauma. They made evidence-gathering simulators for people whose suffering left no scars. They made documentation tools for experiences that resist documentation. They made spaces where being hunted and helpless and terrified is expected response rather than character weakness. And certain people needed exactly that. So when someone says they love Outlast, hear what they're really saying. They love that something finally represented their experience accurately. They love that someone took their suffering seriously enough to build game systems around it. They love that their vulnerability got validated rather than fixed. They love that they found space where they don't have to apologize for being afraid, where survival is achievement, where documenting horror counts as heroism even when you can't stop the horror itself.